Although the horror game boom has died down a little since the likes of Amnesia caused a ruckus around the beginning of the decade, the genre has continued to produce amazing experiences year after year. No longer confined to the first-person walking sims that led indie developers to success, the genre has diversified in creative and terrifying ways, seeing the introduction of technology like VR and the embracement of 3D audio in particular, which accentuates the atmosphere and intensity even more. That's been both a blessing and a curse though, as the sheer volume of games has resulted in some gems being overlooked entirely, hiding pant-wettingly terrifying experiences you should absolutely seek out and try for yourself. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 overlooked PS4 horror gems you're missing out on. Number 10. Dead by Daylight. The asymmetrical killer vs. survivors horror game type came into vogue primarily thanks to the great Friday the 13th, but Dead by Daylight has always scratched the same itch for genre fans. That primarily being hiding in closets while the rest of your friends get brutally murdered outside. Unlike its closest competitor, the killer here is played in first person, while actually being able to land the finishing blow on any of the human survivors is far more difficult, accentuating the game of cat and mouse even more. Although they're sold separate, you can also buy iconic heroes and villains from classic horror movies to jump into the shoes of, alongside the original incarnations created for the game, of course. Not much has changed mechanically, but it's undeniably cool to watch the Shape chase down Laurie Strode. Number 9. Outlast 2. The original Outlast made waves by blending Amnesia-style stealth horror with found footage tropes, and throwing in a whole load of naked serial killers into the mix for good measure. Instead of trying to simply repeat the formula that worked so well the first time round for the sequel though, developers at Red Barrels attempted to reinvent the series by introducing more surreal horror elements and swapping out the claustrophobic hallways of the original asylum for the wide-open woods of northern Arizona. Not every idea worked admittedly, but the new abstract method of storytelling did contribute to a fascinating horror plot, even if it didn't make all that much sense. Throw in a couple of crucifixions, apocalyptic dreams, and plenty of knob terror, and you were left with a game that haunted you long after putting it down. Number 8. Detention. By far the most esoteric game on this list, 2017's Detention isn't the flashiest horror title, but it's easily one of the most unsettling. Doing so much with so little, the 2D side-scroller is heaped in atmosphere, helped in no small part by its claustrophobic setting. Dropping you into a creepy school stationed in 1960s Taiwan that's under strict martial law, the school quickly transforms into a nightmarish hellscape, forcing you to piece together just WTF is happening. Similar to Silent Hill, not knowing entirely where reality begins and ends keeps you on your toes, while the scraps of plot you do find in diaries and torn up notes make it clear that it's not only you who's being plagued by demons and ghosts. It's pretty short at 3 hours, but Detention never overstays its welcome by being a brisk tour de force of pure unease. Number 7. Layers of Fear. Unlike other entries on this list, Layers of Fear forgoes grounded horror in favour of grandiose gothic terror. Unfortunately, that rubbed some critics and players the wrong way, as if you don't, or simply can't, buy into its haughty brand of scares, then you'll probably find it funnier than you're supposed to. Still, reveling in this subgenre does give it a distinct identity, and as a throwback to Victorian horror, it more than succeeds. From a gameplay perspective, it more than holds up as well, mostly freeing itself from the shackles of forced stealth sections and conventional enemies in general. Instead, it makes the environment the biggest threat, constantly transforming before your very eyes. You can't trust anything you see, and the way the developers warp the player's perspective makes Layers of Fear closer to a nightmare than a game. Number 6. Get Even. At first glance, Get Even looks like it could be a straight-to-DVD action movie. The actual plot is far stranger than it initially appears though, with main character Cole waking up in an abandoned asylum with a piece of tech attached to his head that can read memories. On top of that, the only thing he remembers was attempting to rescue a kidnapped girl with a bomb strapped to her chest. Though I'm sure we've all woken up after a night out in a similar sticky situation, the premise is immediately gripping here, even if the gameplay itself is less so. It's the investigative work that's the most compelling part of the action though, as you use a kitted out smartphone to analyze clues and evidence to piece the story together. It's a bit B-movie at times and the production values aren't all that great, but the sci-fi thriller ideas at the heart of Get Even's mind-blowing plot more than make up for its shortcomings. Number 5. The Persistence, PSVR. Although this entire list could be made up of excellent PSVR titles, it's the recent The Persistence that deserves more attention should you own Sony's add-on. A roguelike at heart, the release puts you in the shoes of a survivor boarding a spaceship littered with zombie-like monsters. Your goal is to get through to the 5th floor, which is far easier said than done. Roguelikes have admittedly been done to death, but the arsenal, scares, and of course, unique perspective of The Persistence sets it apart from similar releases in the genre. It's not just a jump fest either. The core survival gameplay perfectly blends resource management, stealth, and full-on zombie punch-ups. However, it would be nothing without its alien-esque setting. Traversing the desolate ship is always unnerving, and while the hallways can get a little familiar, the aesthetic captures a sense of isolation that makes every peek around a corner utterly terrifying. Number 4. Observer. Bloober Team's follow-up to Layers of Fear, Observer is a far more confident and polished psychological horror game. Dropping the gothic sensibilities for straight-up cyberpunk terror, the title wears its influences on its sleeve, right down to getting Blade Runner's own Rutger Hauer to voice the player character. Set in 2084, players adopt the role of an observer, detectives who specialize in hacking brains with a Dream Eater. Side note, I'm definitely stealing that as a future band name, and so should you, in order to interrogate suspects and solve crimes. The hacking mechanics themselves are great, but what you'll mostly be doing is exploring this sickly world, speaking to NPCs and slipping in and out of intense surreal nightmares. The plot and gameplay are solid, but it's the rich atmosphere and the believability of this haunting environment that's the biggest draw. Number 3. The Evil Within 2. 2014's The Evil Within was something of a diamond in the rough. Its gameplay and narrative was solid enough, but unfortunately it occasionally slumped back into the same kind of brainless action that dragged down other survival horror games at the time. The sequel, however, completely perfects the ideas found in this flawed original. Not only that, but it also evolved the genre by introducing open-world elements which managed to take scripted scares and let players encounter them at their own pace. The idea of not knowing what was behind the next door made the sandbox feel genuinely alive and out to get you, and 9 times out of 10, going into a new area ended in a multi-tiered side quest you totally didn't expect. Blend in a whole host of influences from Dawn of the Dead to Twin Peaks, and it made for one of the richest horror games of the entire generation so far. Number 2. Soma. On the surface, Soma doesn't look all that different from a whole host of other stealth horror games out there. That's partly because the developers were responsible for creating Amnesia: The Dark Descent, but the basic gameplay is where the similarities between the two titles end. The story follows Simon, a man suffering from a terminal illness who undergoes a mind-mapping experiment that ends up with him waking up almost 100 years in the future. While that means he managed to avoid death, the life-saving operation resulted in him regaining consciousness in a decaying world, where humans are being driven under the sea and are being tormented by a twisted AI. Without spoiling too much, the plot reaches a conclusion that's one of the most affecting of the decade. It's harrowing, resonant, and yet strangely hopeful, and if stealth isn't your thing, there's now the option to remove the threat of enemies entirely. Number 1. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Though it's made its way to other platforms now, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice still has a few extra bells and whistles on PS4. VR integration, for example, which was added post-release, is the biggest draw, making the experience more immersive than ever. Even without that added way to play though, Senua's Sacrifice is an essential experience. Though it's not a straight horror game, its atmosphere is rooted more in psychological thriller territory than anything else. There's no denying just how much influence the genre had on the title's hellish visuals. The narrative as well, all about psychological anguish, is also rooted in narratives pulled from that school of fiction, even if it is wrapped up in a dark fantasy setting. The gameplay can get a little grating, but it's worth slogging through to see this 1 in a million narrative out to its climax. That's all this. I want to know down in the comments below whether you guys know of any games that deserve to be on this list, and while you're there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, you've been watching What Culture, and I'll see you soon. Bye.